Get your broke old ass out of that seat right now." The flight attendant's voice ripped through the private jet as she looked down at the 88-year-old man like he was some filthy stowaway who had wandered in from a bus station. Then, in front of the entire cabin, she grabbed the papers from his lap, sneered at them like they were trash, and hurled them down the aisle. What she didn't know was that those crumpled pages were the script for a billion-dollar film project. Seconds later, she slapped him across the face. The cabin went dead silent. The old man touched his cheek, looked her straight in the eye, and said, "You just ended your own career." 9 minutes later, she was pleading with everyone in sight. Have you ever seen somebody destroy their own life in less time than it takes to drink a cup of coffee? Because that was what this was. One mean assumption, one cheap insult, one slap, one lie. And then the whole thing came crashing down. But to understand how it got there, you have to go back to the start of that morning. It was 6:45 a.m. at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey. The sun had only just started pushing up over the horizon. The sky was washed in bruised purple and soft orange, and the cold air outside carried that sharp mixture of jet fuel, damp pavement, and early morning wind. Ground crews moved between aircraft in reflective jackets, their breath floating out in little white clouds. At the far end of the private terminal, an elderly man stepped out of a dark SUV. There was no assistant waiting for him with coffee, no publicist, no young guy in a fitted suit carrying luggage and making calls, no driver holding a sign and fussing over timing. Just the old man alone, moving at his own speed, unhurried and unbothered, with a worn leather weekender bag over one shoulder and a thick paper script tucked under one arm. His name was Bud Spender. At 88 years old, Bud Spender was one of those rare men whose name had become larger than the industry that made him famous. He had once been one of the biggest stars in film, a screen legend whose face had sold out theaters in America, Europe, and beyond. Later, when most men his age were slowing down, Bud had shifted quietly into producing, financing, and ownership. He put money into films, distribution deals, sound stages, and logistics companies tied to entertainment infrastructure. He owned pieces of things most people never even knew were tied to him. His wealth ran deep, but he never wore it on his body. That was one reason he stayed rich, and one reason he stayed sane. If you looked him up online, you could find awards, old magazine covers, interviews, box office records, and career retrospectives. But you would not find him posing beside sports cars, flashing custom watches, or showing off penthouses to strangers. Bud had no taste for performance in real life. He had spent too many years around people who mistook money for personality. That morning, he looked like almost nothing the average person would associate with private aviation. He wore a plain dark coat over a simple sweater. His trousers were neat, but ordinary. His shoes were old, comfortable, and clearly broken in. No luxury scarf, no designer logo. No jewelry beyond a modest wedding band and a classic watch that had probably been on his wrist longer than some of the airport staff had been alive. Bud dressed that way on purpose. A long time ago, he learned a lesson that never stopped proving itself true. The way people treat you when they think you are ordinary tells you more about them than anything they could ever say out loud. He walked through the private terminal and gave a quiet nod to the woman at the desk. She smiled warmly and checked him through without hesitation. She knew exactly who he was, not because he announced himself, but because she had seen him before, and because Bud, even dressed like that, still carried a kind of authority that did not need decoration. On the tarmac, his aircraft waited. It was a Gulfstream G700, sleek and black and silver, an extraordinary machine worth tens of millions. The jet was held under one of Bud's corporate entities, Spender Motion Holdings, and managed through Lux Air Atlantic, a private aviation firm that handled staffing, scheduling, maintenance, and onboard operations for high-end clients. Bud climbed the stairs at an easy pace. The cabin door opened, and with it came the familiar scent of leather, polished wood, and the faint, warm sweetness of a diffuser near the galley. Inside, the aircraft was elegant without being flashy. Cream-colored seats, dark walnut trim, a conference section with recessed screens, a private suite farther back behind frosted glass. Bud moved to his usual seat in the second row on the window side. He set his weekender bag in the seat next to him, laid the printed script across his lap, slipped on his reading glasses, and pulled a pen from his coat pocket. Bud did not trust tablets much anymore. He hated reading on bright screens. He liked paper, weight, margins, ink, and the physical feeling of revising a scene line by line. So while younger men would have been scrolling through notes on some glowing device, Bud sat there with a paper script, making edits by hand like he had done for decades. He was flying to Savannah, Georgia, for a closing meeting on a major deal involving a studio-backed historical project, a regional logistics acquisition, and a production facility partnership. Even at 88, Bud Spender was still working, still thinking, still building, still making decisions that moved money and careers and projects across state lines. To anybody who knew who he was, the sight made perfect sense. To somebody who judged by appearance alone, it did not. That somebody was Candace Moore. Candace was 44 years old and had been a senior flight attendant with Luxair Atlantic for 12 years. Her hair was pulled back tight. Her uniform was pressed to perfection. Her makeup was immaculate. Her smile, when she used it, was thin and cold enough to chill water. Among her co-workers, she had a reputation. If people were being polite, they called her difficult. If they were being honest, usually in the galley, in crew vans, or in low voices over coffee, they said Candace had a nasty habit of deciding who deserved respect based on what they looked like. If a passenger came aboard in expensive clothes, polished shoes, and the kind of body language that shouted wealth, Candace could be all warmth and polished service. But if someone looked plain, old, tired, or not obviously rich enough for her taste, something in her changed. Her face tightened. Her voice sharpened. Her patience vanished. There had been complaints over the years. Not one, not two, several. One came from an elderly businessman who said Candace asked him 3 times whether he was in the correct section simply because he wore a cheap windbreaker and carried his own bag. Another came from a middle-aged woman traveling alone who said Candace made a point of asking for proof of seating over and over because she didn't look like private charter clientele. A third came from a retired couple who claimed Candace treated them like intruders because they had dressed for comfort instead of image. Every one of those complaints had been investigated by the same middle manager. Everyone had been closed with some variation of the same language. Insufficient evidence. Miscommunication. No further action. This morning, Candace was not even supposed to be on Bud's flight. Her regular assignment had been cancelled because of a maintenance issue, and she was reassigned at the last minute to the Teterboro charter. She arrived, rushed, annoyed, and careless. She did not review the passenger manifest carefully. She did not check the principal client profile. She did not take the extra 30 seconds to confirm who held the aircraft management agreement and who was authorized to sit where. She boarded the aircraft, entered the main cabin, and saw what she thought she understood immediately. An old man in simple clothes, with a worn bag and a paper script, sitting in the owner section. Her smile vanished, her back straightened, her eyes narrowed. She did not ask politely who he was. She did not verify anything. She did not call the desk. She simply assumed he was in the wrong place. That assumption was about to cost her everything. Candace came down the aisle fast, heels clicking sharply against the floor. She stopped directly in front of Bud and folded her arms. "Can I see your boarding confirmation?" Her tone was not neutral. It was not even professional. It had accusation built into it from the start, the voice of someone who had already made up her mind and only wanted proof to support her own prejudice. Bud looked up from the page he had been marking. Without changing expression, he took the folded travel paperwork from the front of the script and held it out. Candace gave it a quick glance. Too quick. "This shows there's a booking," she said, "but it doesn't tell me you're supposed to be sitting in this section." She said this section like the words were dirty. Bud set the paper back on his lap. "I'm sitting exactly where I'm meant to be." His voice was calm, unhurried, almost gentle. It was the sort of calm that comes from decades of being underestimated and having no need to prove anything to the wrong people. Candace set both hands on her hips. "Sir, this area is reserved for the owner party. Maybe there was some confusion at the desk. Maybe you boarded the wrong aircraft. It happens." Then she gave him a smile that was technically a smile but carried no warmth at all. "There are standard seats in the back. That would be more appropriate." Bud did not argue. He did not defend himself. He did not even sigh. He just looked at her for one long, steady moment, put his glasses back on, and returned to the script. That silence hit Candace harder than any insult could have. You could see it in the way her nostrils flared, in the twitch at the side of her jaw, in the stiff way her shoulders lifted. She was not used to being ignored, especially not by someone she had already decided was beneath her. She turned sharply, reached for Bud's weekender bag from the seat beside him, and picked it up with both hands. "Let me help you move," she said. "You'll be more comfortable in the back." She did not ask for permission. She simply took his bag and started down the aisle with it. Bud rose from his seat. Even at 88, he still had presence. He was broad in the shoulders, steady on his feet, and carried that quiet physical strength older men sometimes keep long after the world expects them to shrink. He did not shout. He did not rush toward her. He simply said, clear and firm, "Put my bag down. I'm not moving." Candace stopped. She turned around slowly, still holding the bag. For half a second, something flickered across her face. Surprise, maybe even a small current of uncertainty. But her pride swallowed it almost instantly. She let the bag drop, not gently, not by accident. She let it hit the floor with a heavy thud that echoed through the cabin. Then she leaned in just slightly and lowered her voice. "You do not want to make this difficult." As she turned away, she muttered loud enough for anyone nearby to hear, "This is exactly what happens when people don't know their place." From the galley doorway, a younger woman had been watching everything. Elaine Foster, 26 years old, junior flight attendant, 6 months into the job. She stood frozen with a tray of glasses in her hands, barely breathing. She had seen Candace be rude before. She had heard the stories from other crew members. But this was different. This was not normal impatience. This was targeted humiliation. Elaine wanted to say something. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. Candace had seniority. Candace had influence. And everybody remembered what had happened the year before when a younger attendant openly contradicted her during a briefing. Officially, it had been called a transfer for staffing needs. Unofficially, everybody knew it was punishment. So Elaine stayed quiet. For now, Bud bent, picked up his own bag, set it back where it belonged, and sat down again. He lifted the script, adjusted his glasses, and returned to the page. His face was unreadable, the kind of stillness that could mean patience or fury or both. Candace was not done. She came back, now openly flushed with anger, and stood directly in front of him again. "I'm going to say this one more time," she said, louder than necessary. "You either show me valid identification proving you belong in this section, or I call ground security and have you physically removed from this aircraft." Bud took off his glasses slowly. "I'd like to speak to your captain." Candace gave a short laugh of disbelief. "You do not get to make demands on my aircraft. You are a passenger. I am the crew. I decide who sits where, and I'm telling you that you do not belong here." She pointed toward the rear cabin. "Move." Bud looked at her with the same steady calm. "I'm not going anywhere. Do what you think you need to do." Something in Candace snapped. Maybe it was his tone. Maybe it was the fact that he would not plead. Maybe it was the simple, unbearable reality that an old man dressed like nobody important was sitting in the best section of the plane and refusing to submit to her invented authority. She reached toward his lap and grabbed for the script. Her hand moved fast, like she was snatching something away from a child. Bud reacted instinctively and pulled the pages back toward himself. In the motion, the back of his hand brushed her wrist. Barely. It was the natural reflex of a person protecting his property when somebody lunges into his space. Candace jerked backward as though she had been attacked. Her eyes went wide. Her mouth fell open. Then she swung. Her palm landed across his face with full force. The sound exploded through the cabin. In the galley, Elaine dropped a glass. It shattered on the floor. Bud's head turned slightly with the impact. A red mark rose across his cheek almost at once. He sat still for several long seconds. Candace was breathing hard now, chest rising and falling. One finger pointed straight at him. "Don't you ever put your hands on me," she snapped. "I saw what you did. You grabbed me. I had every right to defend myself." Then, almost instantly, her voice changed. It smoothed out, controlled, rehearsed. "I'm calling security. You're getting off this plane, and when they get here, I'm telling them exactly what you did. You assaulted a crew member." Bud did not answer right away. Instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his coat. Candace took half a step back. Bud pulled out a small digital recorder. It was an older device, the kind most people had stopped carrying years ago. Bud still used it for script notes, production ideas, and private dictation. And when something about a situation felt wrong, he trusted it more than apps, cloud storage, or modern gadgets. The screen was lit, a red light blinked. The timer was running. He set it on the armrest between them. "Everything you've said," Bud told her quietly, "is on here." Candace stared at the recorder. He tapped it lightly with one finger. "The insults, the threats, throwing my bag, slapping me, and the lie you're about to tell security." Then he leaned back into the seat and folded his hands over the script. "Now," he said in the same calm voice, "I'd still like to speak to your captain." Most people, once they realize they have been recorded, take a step back from the edge. They start correcting themselves. They lower their voices. They suddenly remember consequences. Candace Moore did not. She stared at the recorder for 3 long seconds. Then she smiled, not nervously, not apologetically, coldly. "Record whatever you want," she said. "When security gets here, we'll see who they believe. A senior crew member with 12 years on the job, or some random old man in worn-out clothes who somehow ended up in a seat he clearly can't afford. Random. Old man. Clearly can't afford." She had finally said what she had been thinking all along. She turned and walked to the intercom panel near the galley. When she pressed the button, her voice changed completely. Softer, higher, slightly shaky. "A perfect performance. Ground operations, this is Senior Attendant Moore on G-Apex. I need security at the aircraft immediately. We have a non-compliant passenger in the owner section refusing crew instructions." She paused, then lowered her voice as though confiding something serious. "He became physically aggressive and grabbed me. I do not feel safe. Please send someone now." She released the button, took a breath, and turned back toward the cabin with an expression of calm distress on her face. Elaine had seen everything, every second. She saw Candace dismiss the paperwork. She saw her take the bag. She saw her drop it. She saw her reach for the script. She saw Bud pull back. She saw the slap. She heard the fake security call. There had been no assault. There had been no threat. There had only been a woman abusing authority because she looked at an elderly man in plain clothes and decided he did not deserve the seat he was in. Elaine knew it. But fear still kept her still. 2 minutes later, footsteps sounded on the air stairs. 2 ground security officers boarded the jet. One was older, grey at the temples, composed, with the look of a man who had learned not to jump to conclusions. The other was younger, more tense, one hand near his radio. Candace intercepted them before they reached the main cabin. "Thank you for coming," she said quickly, hands moving, voice still carrying that performed fragility. The gentleman in seat 2 forced himself into the owner section. I asked him multiple times to move. He refused. Then he grabbed me. When I tried to recover crew property, I had to defend myself. "I need him removed immediately." The older officer's name tag read Sullivan. He nodded once, then walked down the aisle toward Bud, who was still seated, still calm, recorder on the armrest, script on his lap. "Sir," Officer Sullivan said evenly, "I'm with Teterboro Ground Security. May I see some identification, please? Bud reached into his coat, took out his wallet, and handed over his ID without resistance. Sullivan looked at the card. Then he looked at Bud, then back at the card. The name on it seemed to stop him for just a fraction of a second. Bud Spender, not just a passenger, not just a wealthy man. A global screen legend, a principal client, and according to the corporate ownership file attached to the aircraft management agreement, one of the authorized owner party members for this specific jet. Sullivan handed the ID back, stepped a few feet away, and keyed his radio. Ground ops, confirm principal client and authorized owner party for tail G Apex. A few beats of static. Then the answer came back. Confirmed. G Apex is under management for Spender Motion Holdings. Principal client on today's charter is Bud Spender. Authorized owner party confirmed. Sullivan lowered the radio. For a moment he stood very still. Then he turned. Not toward Bud, toward Candace. The look on his face had changed. The neutrality was gone. In its place sat disbelief and the first edge of anger. He walked back to Bud, and when he spoke again, his tone was softer. Mr. Spender, I sincerely apologize for this disruption. Is there anything you need from us right now? Bud held his gaze for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, I need her off my plane. 3 words. No raised voice. No drama. Just finality. The younger officer stared at Candace with open shock. Candace herself had gone almost colorless. She stood near the galley entrance with her arms stiff at her sides, mouth moving before sound came out. That can't be right, she stammered. He can't be. Look at him. There's no way he... She stopped. She did not need to finish. Everybody heard the rest anyway. Look at him. There's no way he belongs here. That was when Elaine finally stepped forward. She came out of the galley slowly, hands trembling. Officers, she said, voice thin at first, I need to tell you what actually happened. Candace's head snapped toward her. Elaine, don't. But Elaine kept going. I saw the whole thing from the galley. Mr. Spender was already seated. He showed her the confirmation paperwork. She dismissed it. She picked up his bag without permission and tried to move it. When he told her to put it down, she dropped it on the floor. She came back, demanded he leave, and when he asked to speak to the captain, she reached for his script. He pulled it back. That's all. He did not attack her. He did not grab her. She slapped him. The cabin went dead quiet. You could hear the ventilation system whispering through the aircraft. Candace took a step toward Elaine, her face twisting with rage. You stupid little traitor. You've been here 6 months. 6 months. You don't know a damn thing about how this works. When this is over, I will make sure you never work another flight as long as that's enough. Officer Sullivan's voice cut across the cabin like a steel door slamming shut. Miss Moore, stop talking, right now. At that exact moment, the cockpit door opened. Captain Gregory Adams stepped into the cabin with his headset hanging around his neck. He had already been listening in on enough of the security exchange to know something had gone badly wrong. Sullivan briefed him quickly, very quickly. The captain looked from Bud to Elaine to Candace, then to the recorder on the armrest. His expression changed by the second. Professional caution gave way to cold fury. He turned to Candace. Miss Moore, you are relieved of duty on this flight effective immediately. Collect your personal belongings. You have 60 seconds to deplane. Candace stared at him. Captain, if you'd just let me explain, that was not a request. 60 seconds. She stood frozen for several beats, eyes darting around the cabin, to Sullivan, to Elaine, to the younger officer, and finally to Bud. Bud had already picked up his pen again. He was looking down at the script. He did not even bother giving her another glance. That seemed to wound her more than anything else. She snatched her bag from the galley and moved toward the cabin door in uneven, frantic steps. The polished composure she had worn all morning was gone. At the top of the stairs, she turned back as though she might argue again, or beg, or demand another chance. But the cabin door was already closing. The last thing she saw before it sealed was Bud Spender seated by the window, script in hand, calm as ever. Candace Moore stood alone on the tarmac in the cold morning air, watching the aircraft she had tried to control prepare to leave without her. The jet lifted off at 7:22 a.m. Once they were in the air, quiet settled over the cabin again. The engines hummed softly as the plane climbed through a thin layer of clouds and broke into blue sky. A few minutes later, Elaine came forward with a cup of coffee on a tray. Her hands were still shaking. "Mr. Spender," she said softly, "I'm so sorry." Bud looked up. For the first time that morning, the hardness in his face eased. "Thank you, Elaine," he said. "What you did took courage." Her eyes filled immediately. She nodded, turned, and went back to the galley before the tears could spill. Bud set the coffee down, reached into his coat pocket, and pulled out a small flip phone. He had never been much for modern devices. He used what worked, nothing more. He dialed from memory. The first person he called was Derek Williams, his attorney of 14 years. Derek answered on the second ring. "Bud? It's early. What happened?" Bud told him everything. The insults, the relocation attempt, the thrown bag, the slap, the fake security call, the recording. Derek stayed quiet until Bud finished. Then he said, "I've known you a long time. You've let a lot of disrespect go over the years." Bud looked out the window. "I'm not letting this one go." Derek did not hesitate. "All right, then we move now." Before Bud landed in Savannah, Derek had already laid out a four-part response. First, a formal assault complaint against Candace Moore with airport authorities, backed by the full audio recording and supporting witness statements. Second, a legal notice to Luxair Atlantic demanding preservation of all relevant records, including internal communications, personnel history, and prior complaint files. Third, immediate review of the company's handling of previous passenger complaints involving bias based on appearance, age, or perceived wealth. Fourth, notice that Spender Motion Holdings was reviewing whether Luxair Atlantic would continue managing any part of Bud's fleet and travel operations. Bud approved every step. The next call he made was to his wife, Vivian Spender. Vivian was 79, elegant, sharp, and far tougher than people guessed at first glance. She had spent decades beside Bud and had no patience for cowardice disguised as civility. He told her what happened. When he finished, the line was silent for 6 seconds. Then Vivian spoke. "She put her hands on you. On your own plane. Then lied about it." "Yes. Bud, I know you hate noise. I know you prefer to handle things quietly, but this cannot disappear quietly." Bud said nothing. Vivian kept going. "How many older passengers has she treated that way? Because they looked too plain. How many people didn't have a recorder? How many didn't own the aircraft? You have the ability to stop this from happening to somebody else. Use it." Bud closed his eyes for a moment. She was right. He told Derek to contact Sandra Coleman, an investigative journalist known for exposing abuse inside high-end service industries. Sandra had built a reputation on stories that were careful, sourced, and impossible to brush away. Meanwhile, in Manhattan, Luxair Atlantic CEO Nathan Brooks was about to have the worst morning of his career. Nathan had spent 20 years building Luxair's reputation around luxury, privacy, and elite treatment. When Derek's letter and the audio file landed in his inbox, he expected a complaint. He did not expect a detonation. He pressed play. He listened to Candace's tone from the first moment. The contempt, the assumptions, the bag hitting the floor, the slap, the fake distress call. When the recording ended, Nathan was still sitting behind his desk with both hands pressed flat against it. His coffee had gone cold untouched. He called Bud immediately. Bud did not pick up. Derek did. "Mr. Brooks," Derek said, calm and devastating, "Mr. Spender will not be taking calls from your company at this time. A formal written response is required. You have 48 hours. Then the line went dead. Nathan stared at the phone in his hand and, for the first time in years, had no idea how to control the damage. Within 24 hours, Candace Moore's professional life collapsed. Luxair's legal team reviewed the recording repeatedly. Their conclusions did not vary. There was no gray area, no ambiguity. A senior employee had physically struck an elderly principal client, falsely reported aggression, and acted on obvious class prejudice rooted in appearance and age. By noon the next day, Candace was terminated, not suspended, not reassigned. Terminated. 12 years with the company gone in a single call. But the recording did more than end Candace's career. It opened something uglier. When Luxair's HR department pulled Candace's full file, not the sanitized summary management usually saw, but the real internal history, the legal team found a pattern. 3 earlier complaints stood out immediately. One was from an elderly businessman who said Candace repeatedly questioned whether he belonged in premium seating because he wore simple clothes and carried his own bags. Another was from a retired school principal who said Candace forced her to show travel paperwork multiple times and told her, in front of another passenger, "I just need to make sure you're actually meant to be up here." A third came from a modestly dressed couple in their 60s who said Candace physically blocked them from taking seats they had paid for because she assumed they had wandered into the wrong cabin. Every complaint had been investigated and closed by the same middle manager, Gerald Dunn. Every closure contained some version of the same line. Insufficient evidence to substantiate. No further action. Gerald Dunn was placed on administrative leave before the day ended. When Candace got her termination notice, she did not accept it quietly. She hired an attorney within hours and threatened a wrongful termination claim. Her argument was predictable. Bud Spender had provoked her. She had felt threatened. The slap was self-defense. Nobody serious believed that for long. The recording existed. Elaine existed. Security existed. The captain existed. And the facts were brutal. Nathan Brooks, desperate to contain the explosion, made an initial settlement offer through Luxair's legal department, a formal written apology, complimentary charter services for life, financial compensation for distress and reputational damage, personal outreach from Nathan himself. Derek rejected it almost immediately. His reply was short. "Mr. Spender has no interest in your money. He is not for sale, and neither is his dignity." Instead, Bud made demands. First, Luxair Atlantic would have to publicly acknowledge that systemic failures in complaint handling had allowed a pattern of discrimination based on appearance, age, and perceived wealth to continue unchecked. Second, the company would submit to an independent third-party audit of its human resources and passenger complaint systems. Third, all Luxair employees, from flight crews to executives, would undergo mandatory bias training focused specifically on class prejudice, age bias, and judgment based on visible appearance. Nathan Brooks agreed to all of it. He did not have room to negotiate. Then, Bud made the move that truly hurt. Spender Motion Holdings formally terminated its management relationship with Luxair Atlantic. It was a massive account. Bud's companies moved their fleet arrangements to a competitor with a stronger compliance history and a documented reputation for internal accountability. The story began spreading through private aviation circles almost immediately, then into business media, then outward into the mainstream. Sandra Coleman published her piece on a Tuesday morning. The headline hit hard. Legendary actor slapped on his own jet after crew member judged him by his appearance. Sandra's story was thorough. She confirmed the charter paperwork, verified the security logs, interviewed Elaine on the record, reviewed internal complaint history, and published carefully selected excerpts from the recording with Bud's written permission. 8. Not the whole thing, just enough. Candace insulting him. Candace assuming he did not belong. The sound of the bag hitting the floor, the slap, and the silence that followed after Bud told her she had ended her own career. That silence was what people kept talking about. The story spread fast. News shows ran segments. Business outlets tore into Luxair's management failures. Aviation industry publications treated it as a case study in brand destruction. Social media lit up, not just because a celebrity had been mistreated, but because the story felt painfully familiar to ordinary people. Older people, plainly dressed people, people who carried themselves quietly, people who had been looked up and down and judged unworthy before they had even spoken. The outrage was enormous because almost everybody recognized the deeper truth underneath it. This was not only about a private jet, it was about the ugly way some people decide who deserves respect based on shoes, coats, wrinkles, posture, and visible status. 3 weeks later, criminal charges were filed against Candace Moore. Count 1, simple assault, based on the slap, the recording, and witness testimony. Count 2, filing a false report, based on her knowingly false statements to ground security that Bud had become physically aggressive. Her attorney tried to negotiate a softer outcome, lesser charges, no criminal record, community service only. The prosecutor was not interested. The evidence was too clear. The trial was short. The prosecution played the recording in full, unedited. The whole thing, the cabin, the insults, the slap, the fake security call. Elaine Foster took the stand. She was nervous, but she did not waver. She told the sequence exactly as it happened, step by step, and never once changed course. Captain Gregory Adams submitted a statement confirming that Candace had failed to review the manifest before confronting the principal client, a direct violation of Luxair procedure. Then, Candace testified. Her attorney had clearly coached her. Stay calm. Stay sympathetic. Show regret. It lasted a few minutes. On cross-examination, the prosecutor asked the question that broke everything open. Miss Moore, can you explain to the court why you assumed Mr. Spender did not belong in the owner section of that aircraft? Candace opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. He didn't look like, he wasn't dressed like someone who... She stopped. The courtroom fell completely silent. She did not finish the sentence because she did not need to. Everybody in that room heard the rest anyway. He did not look rich enough. He did not look polished enough. He looked too old, too plain, too ordinary to deserve the seat he was in. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours, guilty on both counts. The judge handed down the sentence: probation, community service, a substantial fine, and a permanent criminal record that would appear on every serious background check for the rest of her working life. Candace did not cry when the verdict was read. She simply stood there rigid and hollow, like someone hearing a final door lock from the inside. The corporate fallout was just as brutal. Luxair's independent audit was completed 8 weeks later, and the results were made public. They were ugly. The audit found a consistent pattern of ignored complaints involving age bias, appearance-based mistreatment, and class prejudice. Training was inadequate. Accountability structures were weak. Middle managers had repeatedly treated discrimination reports as inconvenience rather than warning signs. Gerald Dunn was fired for cause. Other employees were terminated after the audit exposed either similar conduct or a pattern of ignoring complaints. Nathan Brooks, under pressure from the board and major clients, resigned as CEO less than a year later. His letter cited personal reasons. Nobody believed that was the real cause. But the most meaningful outcome did not happen in a courtroom or an executive office. It came from Bud. A man who had spent years avoiding unnecessary publicity decided, quietly and deliberately, to use his position for something bigger than himself. He established the Spender Dignity Fund, a multi-million-dollar legal support initiative for people who experience discrimination or humiliation in service industries because of age, appearance, clothing, or perceived economic status. Airlines, hotels, restaurants, private clubs, luxury retail, anywhere people were judged before they were treated like human beings. Bud made it clear the fund was for the people who usually got ignored. People who did not have fame, people who did not have lawyers on standby, people who did not have recordings, people whose complaints would otherwise disappear into a polite corporate filing system and die there. In its first year, the fund handled dozens of cases. Several ended in settlements, some forced policy changes, some went to trial. Most importantly, the fund told people something many had never heard from institutions before. What happened to you was real, and it mattered. And where did all of them end up after that? Bud Spender completed the Savannah deal without further trouble. The production partnership moved forward. His business interests expanded again. He kept flying private, kept dressing simply, kept carrying paper scripts and a pen instead of pretending he needed to look modern to matter. He did not become louder, he did not become flashier. He remained what he had always been, a man secure enough not to decorate his own importance. When Sandra Coleman interviewed him later and asked what he hoped people would take away from the story, Bud answered with typical simplicity, "I don't care whether people remember my name. I care whether they remember how close this came to being buried. If I hadn't recorded that morning, it would have been her word against mine, and people who look ordinary lose that kind of fight every day." Candace Moore completed her sentence, but the punishment did not end at the courtroom door. She applied for new work in aviation and hospitality. Rejected. Again and again. Her name became a training reference in HR seminars, compliance materials, and internal case discussions, not because she had one bad day, but because one ugly morning had exposed years of tolerated contempt. Months later, a local outlet found her working at a retail store in another state. She declined to comment. Elaine Foster never went back to Luxair Atlantic. She did not need to. The company that took over Bud's fleet management offered her a better position with stronger pay and faster advancement, and she accepted. When she was asked later why she chose to speak that morning when she knew it might cost her everything, Elaine answered plainly, "Because silence would have made me part of it, and I couldn't live with that." Luxair Atlantic survived, but it never came back clean. Clients left. Trust was broken. The brand carried a permanent mark. What damaged the company most was not just the incident itself, it was the fact that warning signs had existed for years and leadership ignored them until the wrong target had proof. The Spender Dignity Fund kept growing, quietly, deliberately, the same way Bud had built almost everything in his life. And one last thing should be said clearly. The story, as a full dramatic narrative, is fictional, but the feeling underneath it is not. Being judged by the way you dress is real. Being dismissed because you look too old, too plain, too tired, or too ordinary is real. Being treated like you do not belong somewhere simply because you do not look expensive enough is real too. Most of the time, there is no recorder, no brave witness, no clean ending, no public apology. That is why stories like this stay with people, because even when the details are invented, the wound underneath them is something a lot of people already know by heart.